In a small town in rural Iowa, on a Sunday night, 6 members of a family attended a Sunday school program. 2 friends of their young daughter ended up coming home with them to spend the night. They fell asleep in 3 separate bedrooms, 2 adults and 6 children. None of them would survive the night. They would be murdered in their beds while they slept by an axe-wielding maniac. A true monster. Hi, I'm Mindy. Welcome to the Missing Link channel. Each unsolved mystery is just one missing link away from being solved. Hit that subscribe button so you'll be notified of our future videos and help us find that missing link. This is the second video in the series on the Villisca Axe Murder House. In the first video, we discussed what happened inside that home on the evening of June 9th, 1912. If you haven't watched that first video yet, you're going to want to watch it before you continue watching this video. I will put a link up top. I have no idea what side, but it will be up there or up there. In this video, we're going to discuss what happened after the murders, the possible suspects, how someone could commit a crime like this, and how they got away with it for over 108 years. Since I filmed the last video, we have actually passed the 108th anniversary of these atrocious crimes. I will definitely give credit where credit is due. I learned a ton of information surrounding these crimes from Dr. Ed Epperly. He won't say it or admit to it, but he is definitely an expert when it comes to the Villisca Axe murders. He has been studying this case since the 1950s. I watched and read everything I could locate from Dr. Epperly surrounding these crimes. Let's go back. June 10th, 1912. This was the day that forever changed the town of Villisca, Iowa. A quiet Midwest town was turned upside down. People started locking their doors. Parents were afraid to fall asleep at night. They took rotations sleeping in case someone were to enter their home and try to hurt their family. That way, they wouldn't be caught off guard. And neighbors turned on neighbors. No one knew who had committed these awful crimes. Was this person still among them? Long-time friendships suffered. There were arguments that divided the town for years. Part of the town believed one scenario, and the other part believed a different scenario. I understand the frustration, fear, and pain this would have caused. I cannot imagine living in that town after these crimes. I would be so worried for my family. They had no idea whether the killer would strike again. This crime could definitely be the most brutal mass murder in Iowa history, killing 8 individuals, including 6 children, from 2 families, beating them beyond recognition with an axe. I hate to use the word overkill, but these killings were definitely that. The following day, on June 11th, there was a coroner's jury inquest. They called 14 witnesses to testify. I found it interesting that this inquest was done so fast. It is actually extremely smart because everyone's recollection and memories are very fresh. It's likely they wouldn't have forgotten a lot. The inquest witnesses were Mary Peckham, the neighbor, Ed Sully, the employee of Joe's, who was one of the first to come to the home, the 2 doctors that came on scene, Dr. Cooper and Dr. Williams, Ross Moore. He was Joe's brother, and he was the first one to unlock and enter the home. Jessie Moore was also called. That is Ross's wife. 3 of Joe's other brothers were called as well: Fenwick, Charles, and Harry. John Lee Van Gilder was also called. He was Joe's nephew. Hank Horton was also called. He was the marshal from Villisca. He was the first one to go up the stairs and find Joe, Sarah, and the kids murdered. There were also 2 members of the Stillinger family called. The first was Blanche. That was Lena and Ina's older sister. She was the one who spoke to Joe the evening before the murders. Joe had asked her whether it was okay for Lena and Ina to spend the night, and she said yes. I can't imagine the pain she must have felt, knowing that it was her that said the girls could spend the night. Joseph Stillinger, the father of Lena and Ina, was also called to the stand. The final witness was someone I didn't mention in my first video, but I felt it'd be interesting to discuss here because I'm not 100% sure whether what he testified to is relevant or not. His name was Edward Landers. He was visiting his mother that summer, and he was staying the night at her house. She lived a few doors down from the Moore residence. That night, Edward went to bed a little after 9 o'clock. He said it took him a while to fall asleep, but before he fell asleep, he heard strange sounds outside. He explained it as one boy hooting for another outside. Eventually, he did fall asleep. He didn't think anything of it until the next morning when he heard about the murders, and he wondered, could the noise he heard actually be a woman moaning? I'm not 100% sure what I think about his recollection. He could have literally just heard two boys outside. I don't know if it was actually related to the murders. When they asked him for a time, he said it was probably around 11 o'clock. Now, if you remember from the first video, the murders happened after midnight. And if he heard this noise from a few houses down, I would think that other people would have heard noises, especially the neighbor that lived right next door, Mary Peckham. We spoke a little in the first video about how the murders were investigated. Hank Horton, the Villisca marshal, had no police training. In fact, his background was in carpentry. He had had this job as a town marshal for about 6 years. He had never investigated any type of a crime like this. He was just used to keeping peace around town and mainly just keeping the drunks under control. For days after the murders, the authorities continued to look in town and in the countryside for the killer. However, the killer had at least 5 hours, if not 7 or 8 hours, head start before the victims were even found. Bloodhounds were brought in from Beatrice, Nebraska, but they didn't have much luck. This wasn't a surprise to me, considering that 100 people had been in that home after the murders. I don't know how the dogs would have determined what scent came from the killer. I did hear a story that the bloodhound caught scent outside by the porch and ended up tracking that scent down to the river. But then the handlers tried to have the dogs re-follow the scent again, and they didn't have any luck. Unfortunately, any leads or evidence that came from the crime scene or the jury inquest quickly faded away. As time continued on, the investigation didn't have much to go on. Besides the murders themselves, the saddest story that I heard was how Lena and Ina's mother found out about their murder. Since they lived outside of town, news hadn't spread to them about the murders at the Moore residence. That morning, she had tried numerous times to call the Moore residence, but obviously no one answered. She had to have been concerned. One time when she called, she got a hold of the operator, and the operator told her that she couldn't connect the call because everyone in the Moore residence had been killed the night before. That poor mother. Can you even imagine getting that type of news over the phone? I also heard a report that she was pregnant, and that same week, she delivered a stillborn son. Sarah and Joe Stillinger lost 3 children in less than a week. How awful. Thousands attended the funeral of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls on June 12th. That is actually the day I am filming the video, 108 years later. The funeral took place in the Villisca town square. The victims were kept in the firehouse. After the funeral, the caskets were taken to the cemetery by many horse carriages or wagons. How sad of a time this would have been for the family as well as the citizens of the town of Villisca to bury 8 of their own, knowing how they had been murdered, but not knowing if the killer was local and still in town or whether the killer was long gone. I also read about the future of Mary Peckham. Remember, she was the neighbor, and she was so close to the Moore family. She was like a grandmother to them. She was very saddened by their murders. Her family moved her far away from Villisca. She died later that same year, and some claim it was from a nervous breakdown. Some people also wonder if she did hear something that night. However, if no one woke up in the house during the murders, I wonder if a neighbor next door would hear anything either. Researching this case, I had numerous questions, things I just couldn't figure out. First, was there a specific target in this crime? Was Joe the target? Was the killing sexually motivated? Or was it just a random killing? The blunt end of the axe was used on the children, but the sharp end was used on Joe and Sarah. The children were struck about 3 times each. However, Joe and Sarah were struck between 15 and 30 times. Their faces were destroyed. Were Joe and Sarah, or just one of them, the intended target, and the kids were murdered so they wouldn't be witnesses? Or was one of the children the intended target? Lena's clothes had been removed, and the killer had actually touched her body and moved her down farther in the bed. Did he kill everyone so he could be alone with Lena? Or alone with her body? Or was this just a random killing? Was it just a crime of opportunity? Did the killer see the axe in the backyard? Did he see the family coming home from church and just decided to kill them for no apparent reason other than the murderer is a true monster? Second, how did the killer know the Stillinger girls were downstairs? They weren't even supposed to be there that night. They were just spending the night. Did he see them come home with the Moore family earlier that evening? You would think if he was intending to kill the family, he would know that the family had 6 members. And after he killed those 6 people, I would assume that he wouldn't have looked for other victims. He wouldn't have even looked in that downstairs bedroom. Third, how did no one wake up during the crime? Many people have mentioned that the stairs in that house were very creaky and very loud when you walked up them. How did Joe and Sarah not wake up? How did they not hear the killer coming up the stairs? Or did they hear the killer, but they assumed it was one of the children, and they rolled back over and went to bed? How did Sarah not wake up when Joe was hit for the first time with the axe? Or vice versa, depending on who was killed first. Or was it just so fast that they didn't even have a chance to react? What I find amazing is there was hardly any light. It was late at night, there was no electricity, and the killer just used a lamp. The people that entered the house the next day all mentioned how the house was pitch black, and that was during daylight. I can't imagine how dark the house would have been that night. I also assume it would have been pretty hard for the killer to see. Was he that familiar with the house? Did he hold the light in one hand and the axe in the other? Or did he put the light down on a table? In the kids' room upstairs, there is no evidence that any of them woke up. I can't imagine that these killings would have been quiet. However, I am so glad they didn't wake up. They didn't need to suffer any more than they already were. But I still think this is very strange. Fourth, why were there gouge marks in the upstairs ceilings in both bedrooms? The ceilings in the parents' bedroom and in the kids' bedroom showed gouge marks from the apparent swinging of an axe. The marks in the parents' bedroom could be explained by the swinging of the axe during the murders. The gouge marks were above the bed. However, this didn't make any sense in the kids' room. Investigators believed that either during or after the killings, the murderer went into a frenzy. He started swinging the axe with his left hand above his head, causing the gouge marks in the ceiling. The marks were not over the victims, so it was not part of the murder themselves. So weird. Fifth, were there any photos taken? Things were way different back then. Unfortunately, there are no photos that remain from the crime scene that day. A local druggist had actually been a photographer on occasion with the Omaha World-Herald newspaper. When he heard about the murders, he grabbed his camera and headed to the house. He got inside and took numerous pictures. But when he went to leave, Ross Moore noticed the camera in the man's hand, and Ross destroyed the photos. I understand why he did this. He was trying to protect his brother and his brother's family. He didn't want photos of that awful scene, possibly to be in the newspaper. But those crime scene photos would have been important later in the investigation. Another photographer came much later, possibly later in the week, and took photos of the house. However, there wasn't a lot left to photograph. And now these photos are missing. So let's get right into it. The suspects. There are quite a few, but we're going to discuss 4 scenarios. Number 1, Frank F. Jones, a resident of Villisca. Number 2, Reverend George Kelly. He was a traveling minister who was in town that night. Number 3, the murderer was just a random traveler who happened to be passing through Villisca that night. Number 4, a serial killer made his way to Villisca after committing 4 other murders in the Midwest, with multiple victims each. The first suspect we're going to discuss is Frank F. Jones. He was a resident of the town of Villisca. He was a state senator, he owned a bank, and he owned an implement dealership in town. At one time, Joe Moore was actually an employee of Frank or F.F. Jones. Joe worked for F.F. Jones at his implement dealership in town. He worked there for several years. Then Joe decided to go off on his own and open his own implement store in 1908. Somehow Joe was able to take the John Deere franchise with him. Witnesses stated that this made F.F. Jones very upset. I can see why this would make Jones upset. Not only did Joe open a competitive business, but he also took the John Deere franchise. That would be a huge loss of income for Jones's business. The people in town explained that the Joneses and the Moores had deep hatred for each other. Would this be enough for Jones to go kill Joe, his entire family, and 2 innocent girls? To make matters worse, some claim that Joe was having an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law. Her name is spelled D-O-N-A. I am unsure if it is Donna or Donna, but my guess is Donna. Apparently, Donna had many relationships going on. Everyone described her as an absolutely gorgeous young woman, and her husband, Al or Albert, was definitely not someone they envisioned her being with. So it wasn't a surprise that she was having extramarital affairs. In fact, it doesn't even seem like she cared that she was having them, because everyone knew that the operators listened in on the phone calls. Donna would have the guys call her, and they would ask whether or not it was safe to come over. And she would either respond, "Yep, he's not here, come on over," or "Al's here, don't come." Apparently, there was no privacy when it came to the phone, because the operators had no problem telling everyone they could about these relationships and about these telephone conversations. A detective hired by the state from Kansas City, who I consider to be more like a PI, thought maybe that Jones had hired someone to kill the Moore family. However, Jones vehemently denied any of these allegations, and he was never charged or arrested for these crimes. This definitely doesn't look like a contract killing. If a person was contracted to kill Joe, I wouldn't think they would try to kill Joe in this setting, while he was home at night with his family. I think they would try to kill Joe when he was alone. Even if they had chose to kill Joe in his home, I don't know why they would have chosen to kill all the children. I mean, maybe Sarah, because she was laying right next to him in bed and she would be a witness. But none of the kids got up out of bed. They wouldn't have been witnesses. They wouldn't have even known what happened. Even if Jones hated Joe so much, I don't know if he would have gone to these lengths to kill Joe, his entire family, and the 2 still injured girls, especially in this type of way. However, many people in town did believe he was guilty. I'm just not sure. Second, let's discuss Reverend George Kelly. He was definitely an odd character, but I don't know if he was the monster that committed these crimes. Kelly was a traveling minister. He was from England, but he came to the United States in 1904. He was assigned to preach at various Methodist churches throughout the Midwest. He was also married. He was mainly suspected in these crimes due to his movement before and after the murders. He was in the town of Villisca for less than 24 hours. Some people claim that George Kelly was actually at the church program that night on June 9th, This was the same program that the Moore family and Stillinger girls attended. He was staying with a local family about 3 blocks from the Moore house. He also left bright and early the following morning. At 5:19 a.m., he took a train out of town. People on the train claim that he was talking about the murders before they were even discovered. He mentioned 8 victims butchered in their beds back in the town of Villisca. However, these witnesses were not interviewed for weeks, so it's not clear if he was talking about the murders on the 10th or at a later time. He also came back to Villisca about 2 weeks after the murders. He claimed he was a detective, and he joined other investigators and went into the crime scene. He was obsessed with these crimes. Was this because he was just a few blocks away from the murders that night? Did he see something? Was he involved? Or did he commit these crimes? People made a big deal that Kelly was only 5'2" and weighed approximately 119 pounds. They questioned whether a man of this stature could have committed these crimes. However, the murderer was in a true rage, and none of the victims fought back, so I don't know if his stature would have mattered at all in these crimes. People questioned how the murderer didn't wake up anyone in the house when he went up the stairs. There are a couple possible answers. Number 1 is that the murderer was already upstairs, that he hid in the attic before the family got home. Number 2, being that Kelly is such a small man, maybe he wouldn't have made a lot of noise climbing up those steps. Kelly was a sexual deviant, and he had mental problems. He actually had a mental breakdown when he was a teenager, and he had spent time in a mental facility. That's kind of scary when you think that he was a traveling minister. He had once tried to hire a lady to help him type a book, and he sent her a letter saying that she would have to type it naked. She turned over the letter to authorities. The investigators believed that one of the Stillinger girls was posed in her bed and her undergarments were removed. She wasn't sexually assaulted, but did the killer pose her for his sick pleasure? Kelly was also left-handed. The investigators believed that the killer was left-handed due to the axe strikes and the gouges in the ceiling. In 1917, the grand jury actually indicted George Kelly and he was arrested. There was no real evidence to tie him to the murders. It was the prosecution's claim that he left the house that he was staying at that night, which was about 3 blocks from the Moore house. He wanted to spy on the Stillinger girls, who he had seen at the church earlier that night. Prosecutors speculated that he walked to the Moore house and peeked in the windows. What would have changed him from a peeping Tom to an axe-wielding maniac? Right before the trial, it is alleged that the prosecutor and the police were very worried about their lack of evidence, so they tried to get a confession out of Kelly, and that's exactly what they got. The confession was so weird. He claimed that the Lord told him to commit the crimes, that he went up to the house, saw the axe, went inside, murdered the parents, and the Lord told him that his work wasn't done. He murdered the children, same thing. He was told to continue, and then he murdered the Stillinger girls. However, he recanted this confession right away. The jury ended up not believing his confession either. In the first trial, it ended with a hung jury, 11-1 for acquittal. The second trial led to his complete acquittal. George Kelly was the only one that was ever tried for these murders. Third, did a random stranger come to town and commit the murders? If this is the case, it makes sense of how this murderer was never identified. Remember, Villisca had just had the railroad come to town, and they were on the way to Chicago. It would be easy for an outsider to make it to town. If he came and went before anyone saw him, it would be virtually impossible for him to ever be identified, especially during this time when fingerprint analysis was fairly new. There was no fingerprint national database. There was no blood evidence collected. Fourth, a serial killer. Was this murder a single incident, or was it connected to other murders throughout the Midwest? Investigators learned about numerous axe murders around the Midwest before the Villisca Axe murders. Could these be related? Was there a serial killer traveling throughout the Midwest and picking families to kill at random? Here is a map showing the locations of the 5 crime scenes. The first in Colorado Springs, Colorado. The second in Monmouth, Illinois. The third in Ellsworth, Kansas, which is in central Kansas. The fourth in Paola, Kansas, which is in eastern Kansas. And the fifth in Villisca, Iowa. In September of 1911, 9 months before the Villisca killings, an axe murderer appeared in Colorado Springs, Colorado. A husband, wife, and child was killed in one home, and then a woman and 2 children were killed in another home by an axe-wielding murderer. These were known as the Burnham-Wayne murders. Just like in Villisca, the killer in Colorado covered the windows as well. He also covered the victims' faces. In Villisca, the murderer used clothes to cover the windows and the mirrors. In Colorado, he used bed sheets to cover the windows. The murderer covered the victims' heads in all 3 of these crimes. The murderer also attempted to remove the blood from the axe. The killer also locked the house when he left these 2 crime scenes. A month later, October 1st, 1911, another murder happened in Mammoth, Illinois. He killed the Dawson family, a husband, a wife, and their young daughter. He bludgeoned them to death in their beds while they slept. He used a gas pipe to commit these crimes. October 15th, 1911, just 2 weeks after the last murder, another murder happened in Ellsworth, Kansas. The Showman family was killed, a husband, a wife, and 3 children. The wife was sexually posed after her murder, just like Lena in Villisca. There was evidence that night the murderer attempted to break into another home in that town. A week before the Villisca murders, on June 5th, 1912, a couple in Paola, Kansas was murdered. Paola, Kansas is a small town not far from Kansas City. Roland and Anna Hudson, a young couple, was murdered. They were believed to be killed with either a pickaxe or a hammer, but that weapon has never been located. The killer possibly went to another home that night. A mother and her daughter woke up to the sound of glass breaking. They saw a man with a lamp in his hand, and when they screamed, he retreated. In his hurry to leave, he dropped the chimney of the lamp, and he also dropped a piece of clothing. The piece of clothing belonged to a woman, and that woman was Anna Hudson, the woman he had just murdered earlier that night. So it was believed to be the same killer. Could these 5 crimes be connected? They all had striking similarities. All happened on the weekend. In fact, all but one happened on a Sunday night. In all of these murders, the windows of the home were covered, and the victims' faces were covered as well. The murderer also used an axe or blunt instrument that came from the victim's home. All of the victims were struck in their head. They were all struck and killed while sleeping. None of these murders had a clear suspect, a clear motive, and nothing was stolen from the homes. None of these murders have been solved either. The Villisca murders were the last murders of this kind in the area during the time. Why was that? Did the killer just stop? Did he die? Or did he go to jail for some other crime? Authorities investigated leads all over the country for the next few years, but they didn't lead to anything. The years just continued to pass with no answers. The home in Villisca was originally built in 1868. It was on the edge of town, so it had a lot of land. In 1903, Joe Moore purchased the home for his family, and they lived there for 9 years. After the brutal murders, the home had many owners. And between the 1930s and the 1990s, the home went through a major transformation. Vinyl siding replaced the wood outside. The front and back porches were enclosed. Plumbing and electricity was added. The original pantry in the basement was turned into a bathroom, and the original outbuildings were removed. However, in 1994, Darwin and Martha Lynn purchased the home. They were afraid it was going to be torn down. Darwin owned a museum in Villisca. They decided to return the home to its original condition at the time of the murders in 1912. They used old photographs, grand jury testimonies, the coroner inquest testimonies to determine the exact layout of the house, the placement of the furniture, so they could return the home to its original condition at the time of the murders. The vinyl siding was removed and the outside became wood again. The front and back porches were returned to their original state. The electrical and plumbing fixtures were removed. The downstairs bathroom was removed and turned back into the pantry. The outbuildings, including a chicken coop, were built, and the home was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1998. I still hope to go to Villisca, the cemetery, and the house later this summer. I will definitely do another video when I am able to have a tour. Paranormal investigators and just curious individuals are able to take a tour of the house, the property, and even have an overnight stay. I will go into more of the paranormal things that have happened around the house in that third video. But I will share with you one interesting thing I heard about a paranormal investigator. A paranormal investigator from Wisconsin was spending the night in the house, and for some reason, he stabbed himself in the chest. Police were called about 12:45 a.m., and he was rushed to the hospital. I do believe he survived, though. 108 years have passed since that awful night in June 1912, and yet the murder remains unsolved. The murderer was never punished for his crime. What do you think happened that night? Do you think it was Jones, Kelly, a random traveler coming through town, or a serial killer? Thank you for joining me here today. If you enjoy hearing about unsolved mysteries, make sure you hit that like button so I know you enjoy this type of content, and hit that subscribe button so you'll be notified of my future videos. And if you have any case suggestions, drop me an email. The email is listed in the description box below. And also follow me on social media so you can see what cases I am working on next. As always, have a wonderful day. Watch out for each other and keep looking for that missing link. Love ya, and see you in my next video.